The summer, the wells went dry. Nora Voss stood at the center of the Harwick Fairgrounds with 75 mules at her back and a county full of desperate people arranged before her in the white hammer heat, and not one of them was laughing anymore. The laughter had come 11 months earlier, loud and easy, the kind that cost nothing and remembers itself fondly. But that morning in July, with the grass gone to wire and the creek bed showing their pale limestone bones, the people of Cutter's Bluff stood in silence that had weight to it, like a hand pressed flat against the chest. They needed what she had. Every last one of them needed it, and they knew she knew it, and they watched her face for the verdict. What they did not yet understand, what they perhaps could never fully understand, was that the verdict had already been rendered. It had been rendered in mud and rain, and in the patient arithmetic of thirst, rendered by the land itself in the only language the land ever uses, which is the language of time. Nora Voss had learned to speak that language the hard way, the only way it is ever truly learned, one long quiet day at a time. But to understand how she came to be standing there, you have to go back 11 months to the raw end of August the year before, to the morning she drove a borrowed truck with a cracked windshield north on the county road, and turned down a rutted track toward 43 acres of hill scrub and a falling barn that nobody wanted, and paid for it with nearly everything she had. Preet. She had come to Cutter's Bluff from the eastern part of the state, from a rented room above a laundry where she had worked 12-hour shifts pressing other people's shirts until her wrists ached in the night. She was 31 years old, lean in the way that people who eat carefully become lean. With hands that had already known years of other people's work and were ready, she had decided to finally know her own. She had $940 saved and a classified advertisement she had torn from a regional paper, wrinkled now from the weeks she had carried it in her jacket pocket, reading it some evenings in the laundry light as if it were a letter from somewhere she had not yet been. The advertisement was brief. 43 acres. Rocky. Creek access. Seasonal structures. Fair. Seller motivated. No reasonable offer refused. The price listed was $800. She had written to the seller, a man settling his late father's estate 3 states away, who had never seen the property himself and did not want to. He had taken $750. She had paid it. She drove north with $190 left, a bedroll, a cast-iron pan, a box of tools, and the quiet certain knowledge that she had gone too far in one direction to go back. The 43 acres sat at the base of a long limestone ridge that ran northeast to southwest across the back of the property. The land had once been used for hay, but the soil was thin over the rock, and the yield had been unreliable for 30 years, which was why the father had let it go to scrub, and why the son had let it go to Nora. The barn was standing but barely, 2 of its 4 walls showing daylight through the boards, and the small house beside it had a sound roof, which was the thing that mattered most. The creek that the advertisement had called seasonal access turned out to mean it ran in spring, and went underground by June, reappearing somewhere below the ridge line in a direction Nora had not yet explored. She noted this without grieving it. She had known the creek was seasonal before she bought. She walked the whole 43 acres her first day, carrying nothing but a tin cup and a pad of paper. And she wrote down what she saw the way a person writes down figures in a ledger. Matter-of-factly, without sentiment, rocky. Thin topsoil over limestone shelf, east slope. Mesquite and cedar, heavy. Some native grass in the low. Draws surprisingly lush. Old terraces on the north face, hand-dug, maybe 80 years old. She wrote all of it down, and then she went back to the house, and she made a fire, and she cooked rice, and she thought about the 80-year-old terraces for a long time before she slept. The mules came 3 days later. She had not planned on mules precisely, but she had planned on some kind of animal, knowing that a 43-acre hill property without a tractor could not be worked without draft power, and that draft power in any form would cost money she did not have. She had heard at the county feed store in town, where she stopped to introduce herself and buy 20 pounds of oats, that the Hendricks estate auction was the following Saturday over in Mallet Creek, and that the estate included a number of head of work stock. She drove over on Saturday morning. The county of Mallet Creek was not her county, and she did not know these people, but she stood at the back of the crowd with her catalog and watched the bidding on a John Deere utility tractor go to $3,400, watched a hay baler go to $820, watched a good chest of farrier tools go to $300, and then the auctioneer announced the mules. There were 75 of them, catalogued as one lot, not separated, because the estate had no interest in the labor of separating them. Nora looked out over the tucked, dusty, long-eared congregation in the pole barn and thought she had never seen a sorrier collection of creatures. They were thin. Not the thinness of starvation exactly, but the thinness of sustained neglect, of animals fed just enough to stay alive for no particular purpose. Their coats were rough, and their ribs showed under the dust, and their eyes had the flat patience of animals that have ceased to expect much. Nobody in the crowd moved forward to look at them more closely. A man near Nora, in a clean shirt, said to the man beside him, not quietly, "Those mules were not worth the ground they stood on." His companion said, "He reckoned you'd lose money hauling them to the killers." The auctioneer opened the bidding at $100. The crowd was silent. He dropped to 50, still silent. He looked out over the assembled buyers with an expression caught between professional optimism and private resignation, and said, "Well, somebody give me $20 for the lot." Nora raised her hand. The laughter started at the back of the crowd and moved forward. It was not mean-spirited, exactly, or not entirely. It was the laughter of people who believe they understand something that someone else does not. The laughter of the superior position, warm with certainty. She heard the word fool, and she heard a woman's voice say, "Honey, where on earth will you put them?" And she heard the man in the clean shirt say that those mules had not done a day's work in 2 years and couldn't be made to. And she heard laughter again, easier this time. She paid her $20 at the cashier's table and arranged to return the following morning with the borrowed truck and the stock trailer she had not yet borrowed but would. The auctioneer, a fair-minded man, looked at her receipt and then at her face and said quietly that the mules had been on minimal feed for 6 months and she might lose some of them. She said she understood. He said he was sorry he couldn't do better. She said it wasn't his fault what people didn't want. She had been back on her property 3 hours when a car she did not recognize came down the track and parked with professional ease, the way cars belonging to people with appointments park, as though the land had been expecting them. The man who stepped out wore a jacket that cost more than her monthly laundry wages, and he introduced himself as Clement Aldrich, Regional Acquisitions Director for the Halloran Grazing Consortium, which held, he mentioned with quiet pride, some 430,000 acres across 3 counties. He had, he said, been following the Hendricks estate proceedings with interest and had hoped to have a conversation with her. He sat in her one good chair in her kitchen, which had no curtains yet, and he looked at her carefully in the way of a man taking stock of something he believes he is about to purchase, and he told her that the consortium would be prepared to offer her a fair price for her property and would, in addition, assume the mule lot at no charge, saving her. He said with a smile that was almost tender, a very significant expense in feed and veterinary costs she was likely not prepared for. He named a price for the land that was, she calculated silently, $140 more than she had paid for it. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "I just moved in." He said he understood, and that the offer stood, and that he hoped she would think carefully about her situation, a woman alone. And he left his card on her table and stood and thanked her for her time. She walked him to his car. When he drove away, she stood in the track dust and looked at the card, and then she set it on the fence post at the end of the track, and she went to begin clearing the barn for 75 mules. The first month was the hardest thing she had ever done, and she had done hard things. She had hauled the mules home in 4 trips and sorted them into the barn and the adjacent lots she fenced with wire and cedar posts. She cut herself from the property, and she had spent 60 of her remaining $190 on hay and ground feed because the mules needed something solid in them before they could begin to use the land. She counted them every morning. In the first 2 weeks she lost 4, quietly, without fuss, in the way that neglected animals sometimes simply decide the world is too much effort. She buried each one in the low draw with a hand-dug hole that cost her a full day's labor per animal, because she would not leave them to rot in her field. After the 4th burial, she sat on the edge of the hole and did the arithmetic. She had $61 left. She had 71 mules. She had 43 acres of scrub. She had a house with no curtains and a barn with 2 walls that let in the weather, and she had the Halloran Consortium's card on her fence post beginning to curl in the sun. She sat in that hole, and she did the figures forward and backward, and they did not improve with repetition. She thought about going back. She thought about it seriously, the way you think about a thing when you're giving it a fair hearing. And then she climbed out of the hole and filled it in and washed her hands at the pump and heard from across the lot the sound of the eldest mule, a broad-chested gray animal of perhaps 16 years, who she had not yet named, pressing his long nose through the fence-board gap to lip at a stand of native grass growing against the post, pulling it in with a concentration that was almost serene, and something in that ordinary patient particular attention to eating held her like a hand on the shoulder. She did not know she had a neighbor until the neighbor appeared. He came across the top of the ridge on the 7th morning of September, an old man in a canvas hat walking with a stick, and he came down the north face of the ridge without any particular hurry, and arrived at her fence line and stood there looking at the mules in the lot. He was perhaps 80, his face the weathered architectural brown of someone who has worked outside on 2 continents. And he carried in his free hand a cloth bag that turned out to contain a paper-wrapped portion of dark bread, and a jar of something preserved that she could not immediately identify. His name was Theodore Havrila, and he had come, as he explained in English that was perfectly competent, and carried in it the soft remnant of a Central European language she could not place, from a valley east of the Carpathians 60 years ago, and he had farmed the 42 acres on the other side of the ridge in the same quiet way he did everything else. Without calling much attention to himself, he said he had watched her trucks come, and he had watched her fence posts go in, and he had decided it was time to introduce himself. She made coffee. He sat in the chair Clement Aldrich had sat in, and he looked at the land through the kitchen window, and he said, after a while, in the soft cadence that she would come to know as his particular register of seriousness, that this land was not bad land. It was only land that people had been reading wrong. She asked him what he meant. He said, in the way of a man quoting himself, that the land does not shout what it knows. It sets out the evidence in small things, and then it waits to see if you are the kind of person who pays attention. He said this without any condescension, as a simple statement of natural fact. And then he ate his bread, and she ate hers, and they looked out the window at the mules in the lot, and he said, after a further silence, that mules no water. He said it plainly once and did not elaborate, and she wrote it in her ledger that evening as its own line item. The way you record a figure you do not yet know how to use, but are certain, has a place in the final sum. The boy came in October. He was 10 years old, solemn in the manner of children who have learned early that silence is safer than speech, and his name was Ellis Greer, the youngest son of a tenant family on the property adjacent to the south, who worked what remained of a played-out sorghum operation for a landowner they rarely saw. He appeared one morning at the barn without announcement and watched Nora fork hay for 20 minutes without speaking, and then he asked if those were all her mules. She said they were. He said he had counted 71. She said that was right. He said the gray one was the boss. She said she reckoned so. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that, always before school, always with the same composed watchfulness, and within a week he was forking the west side of the barn while she forked the east. and neither of them felt any need to remark on the arrangement. He began naming the mules, not all at once, but incrementally, a name appearing when a name seemed warranted, the way things are named in nature, because a quality insists on being recognized. He named the gray one Compass. She did not ask why. When she heard the name, she understood why. It was Compass who led her to the water. This is not a poetic claim. It is what happened. She had spent October and into November doing what Theodore had told her to do, which was to stop managing the mules and begin watching them. She put them on the land instead of in the lots, all 71 of them moving together through the scrub in whatever direction they chose, and she followed. She followed for 3 weeks, and she mapped where they went and when, and she noted in her ledger the pattern she was beginning to see. The way they drifted always in the mornings to the north face of the ridge. The way Compass, in particular, would stand at the base of the old hand-dug terraces and put his nose to the limestone shelf and breathe in the way a person breathes when they have come in from cold air and lean near something warm. She brought her spade on the 4th week of November. She dug at the base of the lowest terrace where the water-loving plants she had noted in August grew lush against all reason. She dug 18 inches into the decomposed limestone, and the ground turned dark. She dug 2 feet, and the dark deepened. She dug to 3 feet, and water seeped into the floor of the hole, quiet and certain, from the limestone shelf above. A seep. An old stone-filtered seep. Perhaps the very seep that the man who had cut those terraces 80 years ago had known about and had used to direct his field drainage, and which had been building in the aquifer of the ridge for all the decades since. She stood in the hole with wet boots and a dry throat, and she looked at the water coming in, and she thought about the arithmetic. The real arithmetic now, not the arithmetic of survival, but something larger. And she felt the specific silence of a person who has found a thing that cannot be untransfound. She filled the hole back in. She drove to town the next day, and she bought new curtains for the kitchen. She told no one. She said nothing to Clement Aldrich, who sent her a letter in December with a revised offer $280 above what she had paid. She said nothing to the people at the feed store, who still asked her with polite concern how the mules were getting on. The question carrying in it the sociable assumption that things were going badly. She said nothing to the man in the clean shirt from the Mallet Creek auction, whose name she had learned was Burl Dempster, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county, and who had told 2 separate people at the Cutter's Bluff Mercantile that the women out on the ridge would be gone by spring, broke, and wiser. She did the arithmetic in her ledger in the evenings. She had drilled a simple well point into the seep by January, doing the work herself with a hired hand's occasional assistance, financing it with the sale of a mule she had traded to a small-hold farmer 3 counties over who needed a single reliable animal. She got $60 for that mule. She used 32 of it for the well point and supplies, and kept the rest in the envelope she was building back toward solvency. The water was extraordinary. It was cold, even in January. And it was sweet, in the way of water that has traveled through limestone for decades, filtered of everything but its own mineral clarity. Theodore came down from the ridge in February, and she showed him. He put his hand in the bucket. She drew, and he tasted it from his fingers. And he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, in his careful, weighted way, that the land had been holding this for someone patient enough to ask instead of demand, and that it had answered her the same way. He said it the way. He said things that mattered, once, without decoration, and then he drank a full cup and thanked her for it. The outside world arrived in March, in the form of a woman named Petra Sanvos, who drove a catering operation from the city 4 hours south, and who had come to the region scouting water sources for a produce operation she was planning in partnership with a local farmer. She had heard from Theodore, who knew her as a distant relation by marriage, that there was a clean spring source on the ridge property. She came on a Tuesday, tasted the water, and said immediately that it was the finest she had encountered in years of looking, with a mineral profile that was ideal for the salad greens and herbs she intended to grow hydroponically. She was not a romantic, she was a businesswoman. She offered Nora a water purchase agreement at a rate that Nora spent 2 evenings working through with a clear head before she signed it. The terms were simple. Nora would supply from her well point a guaranteed monthly volume of water, measured and documented, for a period of 3 years with renewal options at $42 per 1,000 gallons. The spring, at its tested flow rate, was producing 11,000 gallons a month without strain. Nora did the arithmetic. She sat with it for 2 days. She signed on the 3rd. She had enough now to mend the barn walls and to put by against the summer, and still she said nothing to the town. She was not being deceptive. She was being careful with something the land had trusted her with, the way you are careful with a flame in wind, shielding it with your body until you are certain it has caught well enough to hold on its own. Clement Aldridge sent a 3rd letter in April. The offer was now $600 above her purchase price. She did not reply. The drought came in May, the way Theodore had said it would come, not gradually, but all at once, like the opening of a great furnace door. One morning the sky was the hard pale blue of a kiln, and the air had a dryness in it that you felt on the back of the throat before you felt it anywhere else, and that dryness deepened every day through May and into June without a single break. The wells in Cutter's Bluff began to drop in June. The stock ponds went to mud in early July, and the mud went to crack in mid-July, and by the last week of July, the County Water Authority was issuing notices about usage restrictions, and by the first week of August, the notices had become enforcement. The cattle operations were the worst hit. Burl Dempster, whose 800 head needed a volume of water that the emptied stock ponds could no longer provide, was hauling water at crushing expense in tanker trucks from a source 60 miles east. And the cost of it was eating his operating margin in a way that the math would not survive past September. 3 smaller operators had already called the Halloran Consortium. Clement Aldridge had been on the county road every other day for 2 weeks. Nora's spring did not drop. The aquifer that the ridge limestone had been filling for the better part of a century did not drop measurably from the drought of a single summer. The water came in as it had come, in November and January and March, cold and clear and quiet. And Nora drew it, and she kept her records in her ledger, and she watched the mules on the dry hillside, which was no drier than the hillside had ever been. And Compass stood at the fence in the mornings and watched the county road with what she could only describe, though she was not a fanciful person, as interest. Ellis came in the last week of July, not in the morning but at 4 in the afternoon, which was not his time, and his face had something in it that she recognized as the face of a child carrying a grown person's trouble. She gave him water, and she waited. He said his family's cistern had gone dry, and his father did not know what they were going to do. She said she would bring them 20 gallons in the morning, and she did. She brought 20 gallons every morning, for 3 weeks, and she did not mention payment, and neither did anyone in the Greer family, because there was a dignity in the silence on both sides that understood itself. Burl Dempster came on a Wednesday in the 2nd week of August. Dodd. He came in his truck, the same truck she had seen at various county events, big and dust-covered now in a way that expensive trucks only get when expensive troubles have been standing in the way of attention. He stood in her track, and he took his hat off, which cost him something. She could see it costing him. And he said that he had heard she had water that wasn't failing, and he needed to make an arrangement, if she was willing, for his herd. He had 800 head. He said he knew she had no reason to do him any favors, and he said it plainly without apology, which she respected. She said the water was there and she was willing to talk about fair terms. He asked what she considered fair. She said she considered fair to be the rate Petra Sandvos was paying, $42 per 1,000 gallons, because that was the established rate, and she saw no reason to charge neighbors differently than she charged commerce. He had expected to be gouged, and he stood there for a moment, rearranging his understanding. He said that was fair, and he meant it. Clement Aldrich came the following day. He came not in his professional car, but in a consortium vehicle, a white company truck, and he had with him a man in a county authority vest, who he introduced as a water rights consultant. Aldrich's manner was different from his first visit. The warmth was still there, but it was thinner now, over something harder, and the thing it covered was impatience. He said the consortium was prepared to make a final offer for the property, substantially above market, and he cited a number that was, Nora calculated in the moment he was speaking, $4,300 above what she had paid. He said the county was going to need to coordinate water resources in a crisis of this scale, and the consortium was the right vehicle for that coordination. He said this was the kind of situation in which private interests needed to understand the bigger picture. She said she understood the bigger picture. She asked what the consortium's plan was for distributing the water. He described an access program with a fee structure that included a consortium administrative surcharge. She asked what that surcharge was. He said it was standard 12% over cost. She asked who set the cost. He paused and then said the consortium would establish a regional rate. She said she see, and she thanked him for coming. He came back the following week, and this time the water rights consultant mentioned the county emergency ordinance provisions regarding resource coordination during declared water emergencies. She said she was familiar with the provisions. She said she had also spoken with the county attorney. She said she understood the ordinance allowed coordination, but not expropriation of private water without compensation and due process. The water rights consultant looked at his shoes. Clement Aldrich looked at her with the expression of a man who has miscalculated the weight of something he intended to lift. She said she appreciated his visit. The fairgrounds meeting had been called by the County Water Authority for August 3rd, Saturday, an emergency session to address the crisis and to hear what resources might be available. Nora drove in with Theodore beside her in the passenger seat and Ellis in the back, who had asked to come and whose father had said he could. The fairgrounds pavilion was full, every bench occupied and people standing along the walls, and the air was close with body heat and with the particular anxiety of people who are frightened about something that will not let them be frightened in an orderly way. Clement Aldrich was already there, seated at the front table with the water rights consultant and a county authority official, and he had a folder before him and the settled posture of a man who has come to an auction having already decided what things are worth. When the water authority director opened the floor for resource discussion, Aldrich was on his feet immediately. He described the consortium's willingness to serve as the regional coordinator for water distribution, its capacity to manage the logistics, its relationships with the relevant regulatory bodies. He used the word coordination 7 times in 4 minutes. He cited a fee schedule. He cited the emergency ordinance. He was very good at it, smooth and civic and reasonable, and Nora watched people nodding slowly in the way people nod when they are not agreeing, but are simply too tired to push back. Then she stood up. The room went quieter than it had been. She was not a woman who made speeches. She said she had a working spring on her property at the base of the ridge, stone-filtered, reliable, producing 11,000 gallons a month at current test, and capable, by the geologist estimate she had commissioned in June, with Petra Sandvoss's first payment of sustaining 18,000 gallons monthly without aquifer depletion. She said she would provide water to any family or operation in the county at the same rate she had established, with commercial operations $42 per 1,000 gallons, and that within a 20-mile radius she would reduce that to $25 per 1,000 gallons, and that for the 3 families she knew of in the county who were in genuine hardship, she would ask only that they send whoever had the strongest back to help her with the infrastructure work she needed done, which she would figure was worth a day's labor for every 2 weeks of supply. She said the rate structure would be in writing, filed with the county attorney and the water authority, open for anyone to read, and would not change during the emergency. She said this was not charity. She said it was a fair exchange between neighbors who lived on the same ground. The room was still. Clement Aldrich said that the county would really benefit from consolidated management, and that an individual landowner, however well-intentioned, a woman alone, could not provide the reliability that a coordinated consortium infrastructure. He did not finish the sentence cleanly. It came apart in the middle, the way false things sometimes do, when the room around them has stopped being credulous. She waited until he was finished, not finishing his sentence, and then she said quietly enough that the people in the back leaned forward to hear that she had noticed the consortium's coordination plan included a 12% administrative surcharge over established rates, and that she was curious how Mr. Fakor Aldrich had known what rate she had established with her commercial contract, since she had not shared that number publicly. The room went entirely still. Aldrich said he had gathered the information from available sources. She said she would be interested to know which sources, since the contract was held only by her and by Petra Sandvoss, and by the county attorney under seal. The water rights consultant was studying the middle distance with great attention. Wand. Aldrich said something about regional information networks and county channels. She said she supposed that was possible. She sat down. Theodore, who had said nothing during any of this, made a sound beside her that was not quite a laugh. It was something more like the sound a man makes when something that has been leaning for a long time finally finds its level. 4 men in the second row removed their hats at the same time. It was not a coordinated gesture. It was simply the gesture that came to each of them at once, the way the same word comes to different people when they are all hearing the same truth. Burl Dempster, who was sitting 3 rows back, stood up and said that he had already made an arrangement with the woman on the ridge, and it was fair, and he supported it, and that he did not think the county needed the consortium for something a neighbor was willing to do at cost. Someone said, "Here," and someone else said, "Right," and the county authority official began writing something in his folder in the way of a man making record of a thing he does not wish to be on the wrong side of Totter. Clement Aldrich gathered his papers. He said the consortium remained available to assist should the need arise. He walked out through the side of the pavilion, and the door made a sound behind him. Wood and dry air, and that was that. She drove home that evening with Theodore and Alice in the last of the day's light, the sky behind the ridge still holding a band of copper that the drought had learned to make beautiful, and nobody said much. Alice said the compass had been restless that afternoon, and she said she would check on him in the morning. Theodore said nothing for several miles, and then said, in the way he said the things he meant most, that there was an old understanding from the valley he had come from, not exactly a proverb but close enough to one, that the ground never forgets what you put into it, and what you put into it is what comes back when the dry time arrives. He said it once. He did not look at her while he said it, and she did not look at him. She watched the ridge line against the copper sky, and she thought that a person could spend a long time trying to say what that meant and would do better to simply sit with it. The rains came in September, not dramatically, but in the gradual, thorough way that genuine soaking rains arrive. 3 days of gray persistent downpour that filled the stock ponds and raised the wells and softened the cracked earth back toward something that could receive a seed. The county breathed out. The arc of the crisis bent back toward ordinary life. And ordinary life, with its ordinary troubles, came crowding back in to fill the space the emergency had vacated. But something had shifted in a way that things shift when a community has seen itself clearly for a moment, seen what it needed and where it came from, and cannot quite pretend to seeing the way. People drove out to the ridge, not in crowds but in ones and twos, a farmer with a covered dish, a family with a child who wanted to see the mules, the woman from the mercantile who brought a jar of preserved plums and stayed for coffee and stayed longer than she meant to. Nora received them without ceremony. She showed them the barn, which had sound walls now, all 4 of them. She showed them the terraces on the north face, repaired through the summer with Ellis's help and with the help of the 3 hardship families who had come with strongbacks and worked as agreed. She showed them the well point, and the ledger she kept beside it, every figure in it exact and clear. The kind of record that has nothing to hide. Ellis named the last of the unnamed mules in October. He named a small dun jenny at the back of the herd, the most retiring of all the animals, who had spent 11 months avoiding notice. He named her Register, which was an unusual name for a mule, and which, when Nora asked why, he explained in his precise, unadorned way, was because she noticed everything and wrote it down somewhere in herself. Nora looked at the small dun jenny for a moment and said that seemed right. She wrote the name in her ledger. She had 68 mules now, in good flesh, coats smooth, eyes clear, moving on the hillside with the ease of animals that have been given back the right to be what they are. Theodore came down from the ridge on a morning in November that had the first real cold in it, the kind of cold that smells of cedar and creekstone, and he brought bread and the preserved thing in the jar that she now knew was a plum conserve his wife had made 30 years ago, and that he had been finishing one jar at a time ever since. He sat in her kitchen and looked at the curtains on the windows, and looked at the mules on the hill through the glass. He said the land looked different. She said it did. He asked her if she was staying. She said she was. He said, with the quiet finality of a man making a formal record of something that matters good. He ate his bread. She ate hers. Through the window, Compass moved along the fence line in his unhurried way, tasting the morning air with his long soft nose, and the rest of the herd moved behind him the way a tide moves, following not from compulsion, but from the good animal sense of knowing which among them could be trusted to find what they all needed. The light came over the ridge the way it does in November, pale and serious and very clean, and it lay across the 43 acres without any favoritism. The same light it had always been, waiting, as light always waits, for someone to stop moving long enough to receive it.
Si vous voulez rejoindre, moi je vais ouvrir mon truc là. Si vous voulez rejoindre des parties, vous faites point d'exclamation join Join, comme ça vous mettra dans la file d'attente. Et puis n'hésitez pas à venir sur Discord, sur le pareil salle d'attente ou vocal jeu coopératif. Merci pour les petits cœurs. Jeu de voiture en coop, j'ai pas. J'ai pas de jeu de voiture en coop. Là.